So it's a pleasure to chair this session in particular. My name is Višnja Kisić, and I'm one of the lecturers and assistant professor at the UNESCO Chair of Cultural Policy and Cultural Management in Belgrade that is organizing this conference. I'm art historian by education, but then also a PhD in museum and heritage studies. And it is exactly these themes that you are going to talk about today that are really the core of my interest, and that is how to reshape museums as more democratic places, as more inclusive places, how to decolonize them, how to rethink them radically, basically. So it is a great pleasure to be chairing exactly this session, which is named Museums Under Construction. But I would say, reading all your abstracts, that it's much more than museums under construction, that actually none of the museums that you are going to talk about, or none of the kind of heritage that you are going to address, is actually under construction. We usually think about these buildings that are being constructed and reconstructed and so on. What all of you are going to address, but in very different perspectives, is exactly how we can rethink museums as idea, how we can rethink museum as a concept, but also the very practices that shape the museum, the very practices, the very relations, the very political assumptions on whiteness, on privilege, on democracy, on nation state, on, as we will see also, on the, well, great imperial past, and so on and so forth. And it is this diversity of your papers and ideas that is, I think, going to make this session really inspiring, and hopefully also the discussion that we will have afterwards. So I will not take any more time. It is a pleasure to announce the first speaker, Liang-Kai from the Leiden University Center of the Arts in Society in the Netherlands, who is doing his PhD there at the moment on the topic that is partly what he is going to kind of present to us, or at least trigger a bit of our thinking on how to, well, how to deal with, how to frame, how to introduce issues of not only LGBTQ plus communities into museum, but how to think the queerness, coloniality, and decolonialization of museums in the same terms when talking about these issues. So the floor is yours, and you can start.
Thank you so much, Višnja, for your kind introduction. Am I clearly heard?
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Let me try to share my PowerPoint. Yeah, can you see my PowerPoint? Yeah, great. Yeah, so my name is Liang-Kai, and my PhD research explore contemporary queer politics in the museum and gallery context. My understanding of queerness is not only a deviant or gay sexuality, but a kind of critical thinking which allow us to question all kinds of heterosexual norms and cultural institutions. And specifically, I study queer, artistic, and curatorial practices that questions the social inequality in the museum. And as you introduced today, I will only cover like very specific some case studies on the racial inequality among the queer art exhibitions since the 1990s. And although in recent years, we can see more and more art museums are organizing exhibitions that highlighting LGBTQ plus perspectives in arts and culture, the predominance of cis white male perspective and the marginalization of women and other social minority are still very striking. And today I will focus on the racial invisibility. Let's look at one of the many examples of racial marginalities in this blockbuster queer art exhibition, Art AIDS America, at Tacoma Art Museum in 2015. In these images, you can see a group of activists stages a dying protest in the exhibition venue. This protest was triggered by the racial marginality in this major American art show, which claimed to represent the whole spectrum of artistic response in AIDS in the United States. The activist message "Stop Erasing Black People" exposes the underrepresentation of Black artists. Out of 107 artists in total in the entire exhibition, only 5 Black artists were represented, and only one of them were Black female. This contradicts sharply to the social reality that the HIV infection rate and deaths of Black community remain the highest in the United States since the outbreak, even until very recently. This dying protest does not only expose the racial inequality in museum, it also exposes how a queer-focused art exhibitions could fail to question the racial dimension while questioning heterosexual norms and the silence of AIDS. To address the problem of racial invisibility and to reimagine a museum space which I called a queer museum of color that considers race, sex, and coloniality altogether, I would like to propose first we should look at the institutional constraint of a museum, a modernist art museum, as a white cube that excludes not only social engagement, but also in particular mixed race possibility. Second, we could also learn from the artistic imagination that makes it possible to think about racism, homophobia, and colonialism altogether. In what follows, I will juxtapose an early case studies of a queer art exhibition from the corner of the eye with an experimental film, Aysegul's The Attendant. Both were organized and made during 1990s. By doing so, I want to highlight how the framework of a white cube could not only invisibilize racial others, but also divide racial categories through its display practices and its organization principle. Also, I want to highlight how Aysegul's experimental film, The Attendant, could reimagine a queer museum of color that allow mixed race space, conflicted desires, and colonial histories to coexist. First, I would like to revisit a queer art exhibition from the corner of the eye, organized at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam in 1998. I choose this case because it exemplifies how a modernist white cube space could not only domesticate unruly queer culture, but also segregate racial identity. The exhibition selects 14 contemporary artists, mainly from North America and West Europe. Central to the curatorial approach of this exhibition from what the curator considers stereotypical gay art, often with male muscles and beautiful torsos. Although the exhibition seemed to manage to avoid such a stereotypical image of the white gay male, one local critic, Leo Bunches, notes that the major flaw of the show is that it flattens the very vibrant queer culture production across TV, fashion, magazine, and other media platforms. For example, he points out, you can see the installation here, the Dutch artist Albert van Vesting's black and white photos of men gathering could be stunning when displayed on the street board outside the museum space. However, when displaying on the white wall of the museum, These photos appear to resemble, according to him, a domesticated family album. Although Brunschus points out the aesthetic limitation of the white cube space when exhibiting queer art, none of the critics recognize the absence of racial issues in the show. Even though in the very same year, another exhibition dedicated to Black artists and issues of sexuality was organized. It's titled Black New Identity at the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam. The segregation between a fine art museum, the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, and an ethnographical museum, the Tropen Museum, also in the metropolitan of Amsterdam, seem to reproduce a racial distinction between the white Dutch self-identity and its racialized others. As we can see also in Art America earlier, the white cube space seemed to repeatedly marginalize non-white artists and representation. To counter such a racial marginality, I want to end with Julian's The Attendant to open up the imagination of a queer museum of color. In this only 8 minutes short film, Julian reimagines an erotic SM performance between a Black museum guard and a white visitor against the background of an anti-slavery museum, Wilberforce House in England. The celebration of this 18th century anti-slavery hero, William Wilberforce, however, has been criticized for overshadowing the potential resistance of Black people who were forced into slavery. Against this context, The Attendant does not only disrupt the exclusive white historical narrative, it also interferes with the regulated museum space. For example, in the film, through our multi-sensory elements such as opera singing, SM performance, a clip of the soundtrack of gay porn, weeping, a touch of leather, and another touch of a statue. This film unsettles the regulated sense in the museum such as sound and touch. Furthermore, the staged action between the museum guard and the visitor does not only embody the colonial history, consider the historical relation between the master and the slave. It also transgresses the racial boundaries set since the colonial times. So just to wrap up, I see Isa Julian's The Attendant an imaginary museum of color. It opens up the imagination of cross-racial desires without flattening the colonial complexity. The intersection between coloniality, race, and sexuality is still rarely addressed in recent queer-focused art exhibition, as we can see both in the Amsterdam exhibition and Art America. Racial segregation reappears. I see this segregation as part of the inherent problem of the white cube space that exclude and divide cultural identities and mixed race possibility. And this is the possibility Julian's imaginative film could help us to open up. Thank you.
Thank you, Leung, for a really interesting presentation. I guess there are many questions and we will address them later on in a joint discussion because there's many kind of overlapping or interrelated topics that you're going to be dealing with. So I would like now to take us to Greece, where we have 4 colleagues who work, well, I don't know, is it only 4 of you or it is even bigger project, but who work on a project that really questions and interrogates the Museum of Contemporary Art in Greece, and especially the processes of its of the discussions surrounding its long creation. Marina Markellou from Panteion University of Social and Political Sciences, Tina Pandi from the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Greece, Esther Solomon from University of Ioannina in Greece, and Thomas Vallianatos from the Ionian University in Greece, all of them coming from different backgrounds, legal, art historical, anthropological, archaeological, artistic. So it will be a pleasure to hear their presentation, Hypotheses for a Museum of Contemporary Art, Debates on the Museum of Contemporary Art in Greece as Democratic Space. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Višnja, for the introduction. Can you see our PowerPoint presentation?
Yes,
Okay.
we see it perfectly and hear you well.
Okay, thank you and good morning. So we will start with an outline of the framework of our research project, and we'll continue with a brief analysis of the research results. So our presentation is part of the research project titled The National Museum of Contemporary Art in Greece, EMS, History, Institutional Framework, Narratives, Perspective. This project is co-financed by Greece and the European Union through the operational program Human Resource Development, Education and Lifelong Learning from 2014 to 2020. And it is the first systematic research on the foundation and the operation of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Greece through an interdisciplinary approach. The main axes of the project are A, the cultural processes as embodied in a multitude of narratives developed around the Museum of Contemporary Art in two distinct periods, from 1976, when the discourse around the Museum of Contemporary Art was systematized, to 1997, the year of the foundation of EMS, and by 2000, year of the beginning of its operation until today. And the second axe is the institutional and legal framework for the establishment of Contemporary Art Museum in Greece and the public policy in this field. So I will start with the historical part of our presentation, sorry. So the art of the 70s in Greece was marked by the critical reconsideration of traditional artistic categories that, and the emergence of new experimental trends that redefine the artistic object. Following the downfall of the colonel's dictatorship in 1974, the Greek artistic milieu emphasized the reformation of cultural processes with the ambition to keep pace with international tendencies. As this new art demanded new ways of exhibition and dissemination, the critical discourse was focused on the lack of institutional framework to support and promote contemporary artistic production. Conventional institutions such as the National Gallery or the salon-like annual Panhellenic exhibition became the object of critique in terms of their inability to promote and display pioneering tendencies. In this context, one can notice the systematization of the discourse regarding the necessity of the creation of a museum of contemporary art through a flourishing series of public debates, manifestations, and events. Although these initiatives were developed outside the official state policy by various individuals, such as artists and art collectives, as well as by agents of the private sector, such as galleries or magazines, the term public was pivotal in their discourse. Among the multitude of the initiatives, I will refer to a series of events organized in 1977 by the Desmos Art Gallery under the general title, Hypotheses for a Museum of Contemporary Art, that highlighted some of the key concepts of the period regarding the public character of a museum of contemporary art. Conceived and coordinated by Greek sculptor Thodoros, hypotheses were meant to be, quote, the practical as well as the experiential investigation of the problem of the creation of a museum of contemporary art, end of quote. The aim of the project was to formulate an open participatory process aiming to explore the nature and the mechanism of three different aspects of museums of contemporary art, from an institution of preservation and of evaluation of art to a site of democratic public sphere. The third hypothesis, titled Museum Café, Museum Cafenio, proposed an alternative model of museum as public space. The gallery was transformed into a café, consisted of chairs and tables, as you see in the photos, while press clippings were hung in the walls. Museum Café was conceptualized as a discursive site that dissolved the distinction between art space and social space, considering public and artists in a mutual relationship as active agents. It proposed a counter-paradigm for the contemporary art museum as an institution with an ephemeral character capable of revealing a broad spectrum of social antagonisms. As Theodoros stated, quote, a café as a marginal meeting and communication venue outside the official and controlled circuits of art became the nest where various minorities of art found their ideological and cultural identity and formed the expressive means that were also instruments of action and change, end of quote. It is important to note that in the Greek artistic milieu, the debates around the establishment of a museum of contemporary art coincided historically with a wave of institutional criticism following the political and social radicalism of May 1968. One of the key influences of the museum discourse in Greece was the pioneering work of social theorist Pierre Bourdieu, who in his seminal study, L'amour de l'art, le musée d'art européen et l'art public of 1966, analyzed the museum as a site of enhancement of already established social hierarchies and cultural distinctions. In the Greek artistic milieu, the demystification of the elitist nature of the museum and its reconsideration as a public and democratic institution was clearly manifested in a multitude of articles published by artists and art critics after 1975. The notion of the public within this discourse was strongly connected with a conceptualization of the notion of the museum per se, differentiated from the museum mausoleum and transformed into a democratic space. Some articles even proposed the rejection of the term museum as being incompatible with the priority given to the social role of art. And issues of market, exhibition, museum relations, as well as of politics of public display, accessibility, and communication emerged as central concerns in this discourse. However, despite the intensification of these initiatives during this period, they didn't lead to the foundation of the Museum of Contemporary Art in the 70s. In the next decade, the support for contemporary art in these institutions was suspended and marginalized by the priority given to the ancient cultural heritage that dominated state cultural policy. Marina, will you complete?
From a legal perspective, the ongoing research so far demonstrates that the first and most decisive political initiative for the establishment of a national museum policy in the field of contemporary art was taken in the 90s by the Minister of Culture, Stavros Benos. While institutionally, there has been already established an advisory committee on fine arts under the political oversight of the Ministry of Culture, Mr. Benos decided to establish an ad hoc unofficial working group with experts from various fields, important personalities of art and science. At no remuneration for their activities, they meet tirelessly, exchange views and ideas, and end up in the summer of 1996 in their proposal for the launch of the National Policy for Fine Arts. The working group was divided in 5 fields of actions: museums, education, promotion of Greek art abroad, support of Greek art internally, and other institutional issues. The working group's proposal strongly recommends the establishment of 2 museums of contemporary art in Athens and in Thessaloniki, with the intention to embrace not only the artistic present, but also the immediate past of the 20th century. Furthermore, the working group gives emphasis to the establishment of a Center of Contemporary Art as an autonomous legal entity with an autonomous and independent legal entity that determine their functioning and policy independently from the museums. The most essential points of the working group's recommendations, such as the establishment of the contemporary museums with specific purposes or the establishment of, on a permanent basis of a National Council of Museums and Galleries for the designation of a unified cultural policy in the visual arts, are enshrined in the final draft bill of the founding law number 2557 of 97 on institutions, measures, and cultural development actions. This is perhaps due to the fact that the key persons who were involved in the 1996 working group were also the ones who participated into the legislative preparatory work as the advisory experts of the ministry. The adopted law, among other legislative measures, establishes two legal entities under private law under the name National Museum of Contemporary Art, EMS, in Athens, and State Museum of Contemporary Art in Thessaloniki. Furthermore, a Center for Contemporary Art is established in each contemporary art museum, but contrary to the 1996 Working Group's proposal, the contemporary art centers do not have an autonomous legal personality, but they retain their independence as divisions within the museums. The need for a democratic, open, and public museum policy in the field of contemporary art is clearly defined and reflected in the founding law. This is visibly demonstrated firstly at the explanatory report of the law, according to which the museums should be regarded as modern multicultural spaces and not as typical public services. This consideration was explicitly demonstrated in the legal text, according to which, within the purposes of the established museums are included the promotion of the aesthetic cultivation and artistic education of the public. It is interesting to note that within the founding law framework, there was a reverse reasoning. While the National Museum of Contemporary Art did not have yet a permanent collection, nor his location was then decided, the institutional initiative to enact a law in this sense was taken and the museum was founded institutionally. As Mr. Venizelos stated during the discussion for the adoption of the related law, in recent years there has been a need to create museums of contemporary art to establish state museums. And our first move is de facto and necessarily an institutional effort, because in that way, the museum exists legally and acquires a board of directors which deals with the organization of the museum. 6 months after the law enactment, the first administrative board was appointed by the Ministry of Culture so that all the organizational and technical issues be taken. Secondly, the democratic character in the national policy for fine arts is plainly demonstrated via the creation of the contemporary art centers within the museums in order to present the artistic tendencies on an experimental basis. To conclude, the reconsideration of the notion of the public, as highlighted in the cultural processes and institutional formation for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Greece, is essential not only for the enforcement of its role as a vibrant site of public discourse and democracy, but also for establishing the debate on the mission and future of EMS in the 21st century. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, and thank you for, well, providing this kind of time machine view into the diversity, actually, and also the diversity of methods, actually, but also the discussions between 70s and 90s. And it would be great to explore that a little bit more in the discussion that will follow later. Okay, we go now to Turkey, to Bilgi University, and to the professor who is teaching there for a long time, questions of art history, but also of cultural management and arts management, Aysegul Guchan, who is going to talk about the failing access to art in the case of Istanbul Museum of Painting and Sculpture, but not only probably about the failing access to art, but also how this thinking about the very first museum institution in Turkey has been changed from the time of the First Republic to the new policy enacted by the Erdogan government in recent years. So Aysegul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I'm an art historian by education. However, I'm working in fact, cultural policy. Now, I will try to share. Yeah, I will try to talk about how the most important art museum in Turkey is established by the state in the early years of the Republic turned to a non-existing existence today. I think, yeah. Now, yeah, we are seeing in here the museum I will talk about today, the former home of the museum, Istanbul Museum for Painting and Sculpture, former home. Now, Istanbul Museum for Painting and Sculpture is the first art museum, public art museum, founded in the early years of the Republic, in the quarters of the Crown Prince of the Dolmabahce Palace. Once upon a time, it was the residence of the prince, emblem of power of the Ancien Regime. It's obvious that the Louvre in Paris became the model for choosing the quarters of the Crown Prince as the building of the new art museum, for its being a perfect space where the new narrative of the new republic would be shaped. The choice of the permanent home of the new museum was, of course, a strong statement about placing a symbolic value on the space. Yeah. It was part of the cultural policy to redefine the imperial institutions by creating new symbols. The use of the imperial buildings as home to the new museums was deemed as a statement that indicated the threat of the monarchic sentiment had passed. Its governance was granted to the Academy of Fine Arts. Its name is Mimar Sinan University of Fine Arts today. The opening of the museum was accompanied by a state exhibition of painting and sculpture. It's very important. And it became a regular art event at which awards were given and selected works were acquired for the permanent collection of the museum. And this exhibition, State Exhibition of Painting and Sculpture, is still organized today. It played a crucial role at the burgeoning of modern Turkish art. Istanbul Museum of Painting and Sculpture indeed developed a remarkably vast collection and remained as the only modern art museum until 1970. It has, or it had, I don't know what to say, more than 13,000 paintings and sculptures. Now, the works of art in this museum were displayed in chronological order in 17 large halls in order to show the modernization narrative of the country from the late 18th and 19th centuries art to the most progressive artworks, contemporary artworks produced from 1923 onwards. As a result, originally being the residence of the Crown Prince, the venue gained a new meaning as the reminder of the Western Republic. Apparently, the museum presented a continual portrayal of the Republic of Turkey, starting from its Ottoman past with a focus on the nation's affiliation with the Western culture and the transformation of the Ottoman subjects to modern Turkish citizens and secularist citizens. Now, being the symbol of the transformation from empire to nation state, Istanbul Museum of Painting and Sculpture today physically does not exist anymore. Its story took an entirely new turn in 2007, and the museum building was evacuated unexpectedly on the pretense that it was not suitable for such a large collection. The whole collection was separated without any reason, and major 18th and 19th century collection, either commissioned or acquired by the Ottoman palace, Ottoman port, was relocated in the former venue after a rapid renovation of the building. We are seeing part of it in here. Affiliation of this part of the collection changed, and it was included in the National Palaces section of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. Its name changed as National Palaces Painting Museum. The rest of the collection, which comprises 20th century paintings and sculptures, was located in the 5th warehouse in Karaköy for an indefinite period of time. It's a completely white cube building without bearing any symbolic connotations. This part of collection was again affiliated with the Academy or with Mimar Sinan University of Fine Arts. It's okay. It's now closed to public due to the infinite construction of the new building. We are seeing here very quite ugly, in fact. Two buildings are currently in the jurisdiction of two local authorities, Eminönü municipality and Beşiktaş municipality, two different parts, and 2 kilometers apart from each other. The only thing they have in common today is their status as a museum. That's all. Now, we told that it was based on the Louvre. If the reason behind that diagnosis in 2007 that the building of the museum was not sufficient for the quite big collection were reasonable, the building wouldn't be renovated and turned to another museum that boasts with an Ottoman past. Instead, they would take the Louvre again as an example and find the solution, genius solution. We know that when the Louvre building outgrew for the constantly expanded collection, a marvelous solution was found, and the glass pyramid by Ion-Pei was built to expand the museum to accommodate the growing collection. We can like or dislike, but it's a solution. Now, a bigger disappointment than this scheme is the silence of the interested public. Up to now, none of the museum organizations, artists' organizations, NGOs, or related departments of the universities, for example, museology departments, museum policy departments like that, made an attempt to correct it. Today, not today, of course, I think 3 or 4 weeks ago, Supreme Court of Public Accounts published a report about the collection of the museum. According to this official report, 400 paintings are missing. 42 paintings are forged. Information about 4,024 paintings are missing in the catalog. It's terrible. In conclusion, we, as the interested audience, do not have access to the art collection of the Istanbul Museum Museum of Painting and Sculpture for 13 years. And we are not able to see how Turkey turned to a modern country through art by seeing a whole collection. We do not have any proper information about the future of the museum, of its collection, missing paintings, forged paintings, and so on. The only party who benefited from this tragedy is the private art museums. They organize exhibitions with loaned paintings from Istanbul Museum of Painting and Sculpture. And sadly, most of the museum goers do not pay any attention to the tags that indicate that these paintings belong to Istanbul Museum for Painting and Sculpture, not to the private museum, which is proud of the event it puts on show. Thank you for your attention. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this presentation, and it will be interesting to discuss later about these significant changes that have taken place over more than 15 years, but in recent years, very openly and even more kind of explicitly. So it would be nice to compare some of those examples. Now we move to a really different case and the final presentation of this panel, going to Finland. If Ljiljana Radošević is in Finland at the moment, but she is doing her PhD there at the University of Jyväskylä. After having spent 20 years dealing with the street art as both an artistic form, the most kind of democratic and public art form, but at the same time as kind of exploring the potentials of virtual museums in interpreting and collecting this kind of art. So Ljiljana, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Yes, after all these fantastic presentations, the only thing I feel like doing is just ask so many questions to all of you. But okay, let's face it, we need to proceed, so I hope we'll have enough time to continue. I will just share my screen and okay, sorry. Right, okay, here we are. As Višnja was saying, I do my PhD in Finland, but I actually have been here in Serbia, in Belgrade, for the last 2 years because the project I'm dealing with at the moment is happening here in Belgrade. And the project that I'm working on, as I said, for the past 2 years is called Urban Heritage Hub. So we are dealing with the documentation and preservation of urban heritage, meaning graffiti and street art. We do look at it as urban heritage, even though it's not really recognized as such, but let's face it, it's going to be heritage of our children and grandchildren, so we try to look at it from that point of view. And also we called it Heritage Hub because the way we imagined it, not only as an archive, not as a gallery, not only as some sort of a museum, but a place where all these things can be put together. So therefore, Heritage Hub. So we focus on artworks without permission. as opposed to commodified art pieces that are normally seen nowadays in street art museums and galleries that are emerging in the last 10 years all over the Europe and in States mostly. They actually present portable works of art that are made by graffiti writers and street artists. But in essence, these are not actually graffiti and street art, because these forms of art, these visual expressions are supposed to be in the open, so they're supposed to be in the public space, in the streets, and they're supposed to be done without permission. So we try to preserve that as a context, you know, for everything else that we can see in galleries and museums. That is, as I said, commodified version of what graffiti and street art is. And then, of course, our aim is to actually become a digital institution, solely digital institutions. We don't really want to have a building where we would collect anything. We just need a possibility to digitize everything, to put it in context and to actually make it presentable and usable for the people who are interested in this form of art. So we wish to move from having to being, which is something that was actually discussed in contemporary heritology since 1980s, which says that this trend of collecting more and more and more is not sustainable, and we won't be able to have heritage institutions such as archives and museums in the form in which we have them now. So we are trying to look for a different modus vivendi in order to kind of propel us into new era, but also we find out that this form of heritage protection is actually the best way of heritage protection for the topics that we're dealing with. So this project is divided into 3 parts. We have archive, we have 3D scanned walls, and we have VR exhibitions. So we have archive divided, you know, according to the artist, and this is very traditional way. We also try to give every artist a certain amount of photographs, and each photograph is analyzed from a point of view of the art that is presented in, and also what kind of technical actually assets are there regarding to photography. So that's going to be important for the future researchers. But the most important thing for our institution are actually the scanned walls. At the moment, because we have only one wall, and that is due to the fact that we received a small funding from Ministry of Culture in 2019, and it was enough to get us started, but basically what we can present at this moment, and we're going to go live mid-December now, it is only a teaser of what we can do. Actually, we can do much more, but due to financial restraints, we are capable of doing only this. So this is particular wall that is done for the festival Devet, meaning 9, that happens here in Belgrade since 2015. And actually, it was not a wall that we originally had in mind. But this is the wall for which we got permission to photograph it and to present it. And we also got agreement with, from the artists that are presented here. So, okay, we had to go with the flow and actually do this particular one. But the wall I wanted to do was the one segment that you can see here. This particular wall is situated in New Belgrade, so this new socialist city. And the reason why I wanted this one was because New Belgrade is actually a place of birth of Belgrade graffiti since mid-1990s. And this particular wall has been active since 1999. So since the bombing, NATO bombing in 1999, after that, it has a constantly new exhibitions, let's call it like that. And what is the most important is the fact that I and some other people who have been collecting, actually documenting artworks in photography manner, we have possibility to add a temporal element to our walls. So you can see them how they look now at this particular moment, but then you can, you know, take a look how they looked 10 years ago or in 2003 or in 1999. We can actually make this temporal element work for us. Well, that also requires more funding, and it requires a kind of a different approach to technology, because if you have a small wall, like we saw the previous one, then it takes a couple of days to kind of document this with the photogrammetry and to put it in a computer program and let it crunch for a couple of days, and then you have a 3D wall. If you have a wall like this one that is more than 500 meters long, it increasingly complicates things because it takes a much longer period to actually employ these computers with the firm that we are working with. And also the problem is that you can see that there is shrubbery and growth and trees growing over the wall. And this actually makes it very complicated for photogrammetry system of documentation, and it's not really functional yet. And this would be another solution for us, because this is the wall that is in block 45, which is actually the place of birth of Belgrade graffiti. And even today, we can actually see the pieces from 95, 96, 97, which is very, very unusual for the graffiti culture, because graffiti pieces are not meant to last. But the neighborhood there, most of the neighbors and graffiti writers who live there keep this as an open space gallery. So there is a whole block of this kind of buildings and this kind of old school graffiti walls. And what is important for me in this one was that actually there used to be a piece from 1998 here. And because it deteriorated very badly, then in 2018, two graffiti writers actually took it upon themselves to reinterpret the old school graffiti pieces. So they kept the style, but they kind of pimped it up a little bit. Alas, I couldn't do photogrammetry of this wall either, because as you can see again, shrubbery, lampposts, trees, and so on and so forth. So it actually means that new technology is giving us so much, but on the other hand, is still not on that level that it can, me as an art historian, give what I actually need. So, okay, we had this particular wall that we had to deal with. And then we put it as a part of the exhibition, and then we made an open air exhibition. But since we don't really have time to work with it, just for me to take you through it, I'm just gonna go quickly through some screenshots. But if you want, later on, if we have time during our discussion period, I can actually take you through, through the exhibition itself. So it actually looks like this, and all the walls and everything that you see here was actually researched, contextualized, written, built. So all the walls are built by me. And this actually brings us to my conclusion, or more or less my statements of what are the issues and opportunities of this kind of potential institutions. So it actually makes us think about what is the role of a curator in virtual reality. So yes, we are still invited to create new meaning and we need to educate people about certain topics, but on the other hand, we also need to educate ourselves so we could be able to work in virtual realities and new technologies, and that we can later on, you know, educate people on how to use them. So it's a completely new role, and I think it's a significant shift in perception of old school art historian and curator. And then there are issues of funding, because the new technologies are still very expensive. And for the people who are dealing with topics like mine, so graffiti and street art, we are literally almost invisible for the public funding, at least here in Serbia. And we don't really have access to most of the funding in European Union. So we do need to wait a bit longer in order for these technologies to become cheaper so that we can use them more readily. We still are working with them, but the products are not what we want them to be. Then we have matter of new technologies as an issue when it comes to this form of digital archives, because it turns out that the older technologies, or the oldest technologies, are actually the best one for preservation, because when I started dealing with my photos from 1990s, it seemed that they were badly scanned, and so I couldn't use them because they're useless in VR. In virtual reality, you can't really see anything. But even worse is the case of the first generation of digital cameras. They had such a poor quality and resolution that I couldn't use them at all. So new technologies are being developed and they will be working with these old school digital photographs to make them better. But of course, we have to wait for that technology to develop and for it to become cheap so that we can use it. So on the other hand, the best thing that I had was to actually preserve my films, and now I can rescan them again in higher resolution so that I can use them. And then there is a possibility for curatorial practice. This is actually a fantastic thing. While I was working in it, I had this idea that, you know, if I had this when I was a student, it would have been much, much easier to actually dive into the world of curatorial practices in real time and real space. And I think this actually gives us quite a lot of opportunities in the future. So again, all of this is posing a question, is this really accessible to everyone? So my answer is not really, because new technologies are not really accessible to everybody because they're like still quite expensive. Then we have to think about elderly people, because we've been working, organizing some workshops with elderly people who tried to do graffiti and street art. They're very interested, but they also don't know how to use technology. So in order to actually present something like this, you have to teach them how to use technology, and you actually have to provide them with new technology as such. And then also we have to think about people with disabilities. For example, blind people cannot really access any of these things. And even though we have voiceovers of everything that we do, it's not really enough for them. But then new technology such as 3D printing gives us an opportunity to make some models that will allow them to actually have some sort of experience with graffiti and street art. But then again, we don't have funding to do 3D printing, even though nowadays it's quite cheap. And then we're coming to the last point, and that is headsets. for the experiencing of VR, headsets are still extremely expensive. The cheapest one was produced recently by Facebook, and it's about $300, but $300 is still quite high, especially for countries that are considered to be a third world countries, so not really available to everybody. We had an idea to actually print and produce cardboard headsets as a holders for the smartphones, and that kind of gives you a possibility, but it's not really the same. So, okay, I'm going to leave you with all of this, all of these things that I said to you, and I would just want to pinpoint, we are now basically having only teasers of what we want to produce, but I still think that it's amazing that we managed to produce all of these things so far. And yes, hopefully next year we're going to see a proper virtual institution that we imagined. Thank you.
Thank you, Ljiljana. It's a really inspiring example of how to interpret this type of heritage and this type of art. And of course, thanks for kind of sharing with us all those questions and doubts and issues. And probably there's going to be more of those coming from other participants. So I look forward.
Thank you.
So I will really want to open the floor to your questions that you have for each other, or that some of you who are listening to the presentations of all 4 presentations had for the presenters while they were presenting. And then if you're still thinking about what to ask, I have some questions.
I maybe have a comment for Liang-Kai. I was just thinking when he was presenting these artworks that were contextualized maybe in a different way than maybe LGBTQ plus community would like it to be. I just like to make comparison, because street art and graffiti are used pretty much in the same way. They are commodified and they're used as something to illustrate urban culture. So in any video or a movie or anything like commercial, whatever you want to think about, it is not urban unless it has graffiti and street art. And yet it is not recognized enough to be part of our contemporary heritage. And I think the same thing goes probably for LGBTQ artists that are actually, when we talk about fashion, or we talk about certain artistic achievements or movies, then they're presented as high achievers, and yet nobody really wants to put them in museums or exhibitions in the proper way with the context. So like with the graffiti and street art, you have to have the stuff that is done without permission in order to understand how we got to the pieces that were presentable in museums and galleries. I think the same thing goes, for these kind of things. You have to present context. Just like taking it out of the context doesn't really mean anything for I think, for my topic and for your topic. So yes, I'll stop talking. Thank you.
Hello. May I ask a question to Dragon here? I was wondering, what are your methodologies, and if you are interested in collaborating directly with the artist in the process of the selection of the graffitis, of the documentation of the graffitis? What are your thoughts about this? And are all the graffitis identified and signed by specific artists, or are also graffitis anonymous, by anonymous artists? And how do you deal with these issues of documentation?
Yeah, this is matter of legality, because in Serbia we have the laws, but they are not really enforced. So we are able actually to present the graffiti writers and street artists that work without permission today. But for example, my colleagues from Sweden or Finland cannot really do that. They can present only the artworks that are more than 20 years old. So there is a question of that. Of course, we kind of, I interviewed almost all artists that were active during past 20 years. I still conduct a research continuously with the artists that are active today. They, of course, gave their permission, especially for the pieces that we can see in the exhibition and on the wall. We have permission for all of them, but of course we do try to communicate these things with them. And when we talk about our concept and what we want to do with this urban heritage hub, they think that it's much better solution than just putting it in a museum. But on the other hand, they have their doubts, you know, how will that be used? And, you know, if there, for example, are new laws imposed here in Serbia, how will their status change in that sense? So we have to think about these things, and we have to be very careful when we construct our exhibitions, in which way we formulate the words. So I never use illegal things. I always use artworks with the permission or without permission, because even though it basically means the same, it still kind of changes a perception of the artworks, you know, that we are presenting. And yes, yeah, it's a complicated issue.
You know, if you know the Europeana initiative, do you happen to know Europeana? It's a European digital library where everything, all the cultural content is used and reused, and we push for the open initiative, you know, for the reuse with an open manner and with a Creative Commons licensing. Maybe it could be a great opportunity for you if you go ahead and do a research regarding Europeana, and maybe you have to become a community member.
Right. Yeah, I actually communicate with Grapholution project that did something similar, but with legal aspects of graffiti.
Yes.
And
it is also quite clear with us, with Europeana, because there is also the copyright aspect that is we advise, we have, you know, for free. It's a European initiative, so maybe it's going to be really a nice and interesting for you opportunity to find more practical, you know, solutions to your problem.
Yeah.
And another thing that I would like to say to you is, why don't you think about creating synergies with a technical university where they use open source software tools? So, you know, the technologies are much more cheaper for them. So maybe you could, you know, organize a project, a collaborative project with the Technical University of Serbia.
Yeah, we had a lot of ideas how to deal with things, and then it turned out that if people are not paid for it, they really don't have time to work on it, because most of the people that are related to research units at the universities are really burdened with so many things, are totally underpaid, and basically don't really have time to deal with us. So for us, you know, in order to start this, you know, after so many years of trying to do something, the only solution was, you know, to actually pay somebody to actually do it. And I think we were very lucky, because this firm that is called We Are All Art, that produce VR content for museums and galleries, they actually, they're willing to experiment. So we paid them like peanuts, literally peanuts, but because they worked with closed up spaces, they wanted to see how it it works, you know, with the open air spaces and with the galleries, with the exhibition that are not really, that are rebuildable, so to say. So they are actually like good partners, but unfortunately, you know, we don't have enough money to pay most of the things. But I think it's going to get better because technologies are going to get cheaper and things are going to get more accessible. It's just, if you want things done, you really have to pay people to do it. So yeah, thank you. I don't want to take any more time.
There's actually quite a lot to, well, I guess we all have emails of each other in the book of abstracts, because I think that actually there's really no time for thorough discussion, and especially for kind of building up on the projects which are really inspiring and interesting. There's a really interesting thread going on as well, parallelly to this conversation, in which Anja Obradović was asking, is it really that the kind of Orient or the Middle East, including Turkey, has to be looking at the Western practices and Western museum models such as Louvre, and well, not only in the 19th century or the 18th century, because that was kind of a symbolic moment of turning something from a royal palace to a public institution, so it's a statement, but in today's kind of view. And then they had the discussion about this role of especially private donors and private collectors kind of taking over, and even we could say privatizing these public collections, which really fits well maybe with the paper that we heard yesterday from, was it IPEC?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
She was here, I think. Yeah, here, IPEC.
So
Yes.
if you could maybe also give us this view on how comes, or it's not that strange that it comes, having in mind what we heard in the keynote today, that actually these also quite neoliberal policies enacted in Turkey do kind of go, or do put hand in hand, on one side the privatization of public property, including the arts, and these new opportunities for private donors, but on the other hand, really these kind of authoritarian, imperialist kind of nostalgia about the Ottoman world and the royal grandiose history. So, and maybe in answering to that also, like, how was this whole move with this museum explained kind of discursively, publicly, by the government? Because we saw Erdogan very explicitly explaining why he's turning Hagia Sophia back to a mosque. So it was very performative, very kind of very political statement. Was this the case also with this museum, or it was more hidden?
In fact, is this for me or to IPEC, that question?
For you, yeah.
Okay, okay. Now, the museum issue is very interesting in Turkey. It has been interesting for years, for example, 20 years. As I said before, it can't be separated from the cultural policy in Turkey. Of course, it's a strong part of cultural policy. First of all, we have been witnessing the Islamization of culture in Turkey. That's why we are observing what's going on in schools, in museums, in, for example, in universities. There are, for example, new departments established in state museums on cultural policy, cultural management and policy departments, in order to focus on Islamic culture, not Western culture. That's why museum policy is part of it. Now we know that there are a lot of private museums in Turkey, private art museums, and very, very good museums. For example, Anja and I were chatting in here, there were Central Istanbul, there are Istanbul Museum of Modern Art based on Tate Modern, Oduncu Museum now, Sabancı Museum, Pera Museum, like that. And there are a lot of private collections, really nice private collections. But none of these museums have such a big collection as Istanbul Museum of Painting and Sculpture. We are weeping because we don't know how to access to this collection. It's more than 13,000 art pieces there in that collection, but we don't have access to modern Turkish art for more than 13 years, I think. That's why, yes, private sector and public sector would better go hand in hand, but we don't see how public sector and as the interested audience we will benefit from this. As you said before, IPEC presented a paper yesterday about how little small artist groups and art groups who are not in the mainstream contemporary art are struggling in order to exist in this contemporary art world. From abroad, it's very nice contemporary art in Turkey. There are chic museums, there are stylish museums, there are art fairs like that. But if you are in Turkey, if you are living in Turkey and working in Turkey in the art related jobs, like for example, like me, I'm an academic at the university teaching contemporary art, mainly contemporary art, you see the details that hurt. Yeah. So I'm very, very happy to hear Tina and Maria's paper that there is hope. State is trying to establish a public contemporary art museum. I love that. Yeah.
Maybe going to Tina
and Maria.
Marina.
And Maria, like that here.
It was really interesting seeing how the the difference really in discourse and in methods between the 1977 and this kind of first initiative on the hypotheses, which included the Café Neon and all those kind of really communal forms of kind of working with art and society. And then one could say really this expert-driven 1996 kind of discourse on museum institutionalization. And of course you mentioned public and you mentioned openness and democracy and so on, but it's a very different, I would say, kind of both the tone and methods. What is there any of the 77 ideas that have been really kind of incorporated or that you're trying to revive now, working in the museum and through this research project? So what of that legacy has stayed and is alive?
I think you have a point in pointing out these two different approaches, because this is actually the aim of the research, to have this interdisciplinary approach, so to map all the different narratives and the cultural processes that led to the foundation of the museum in 1997. And it's important to know that the establishment of a museum contemporary of art was a demand for many decades. Started from the 60s, but in the 70s, as we said, one can observe this systematization of the discourse and the intensification of these initiatives. Of course, Thodorov's counter paradigm for a museum of contemporary art is a legacy, and somehow it makes us rethink the Museum of Contemporary Art and how it can be functioned as a democratic public space. But of course, it was at the time it was limited to a more artistic, experimental form that didn't have any impact outside the limits of the art world. But if you want to
from the institutional perspective, it was more the priority of the Ministry of Culture during the 80s was focusing on the return of the marbles of Parthenon. So it was most likely, you know, a priority to give to the classical cultural heritage and the existing demands. And the contemporary art issues were marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
That's how we can see that within our research that there is a lack.
Mm-hmm.
The whole decade of the 80s is a completely gap.
No. There wasn't any institutional initiative for the creation of a museum of contemporary art, only some announcements by ministers of culture that a museum of contemporary art has to be created, has to be established, but on an institutional level, there was
nothing. Only academic conferences, only, you know, some marginalized workshops, but nothing on an institutional level. And this is really interesting. It's an ongoing research, so we are going to find more surprises, I think.
It would be really nice if you could kind of in the chat or somehow else, like via emails, if there is anything in English that could be a moments. Because really like the discussion on contemporary art museums is either focused on like, can you have a contemporary and museum in the same and in the same institution? And then most of those kind of rethinkings of the radical kind of position of the museum are really focused on the critical museology in the UK or France and so on. So it would be interesting to have an example from Greece for students. And yeah,
of course.
That would
with pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
And well, before we go, I have also a question for Liang, and then we can also decide to stay a bit longer, or who wants to leave leaves, because the other panel is actually lasting a bit longer than this one because there are more presenters, and this is why I'm still kind of keeping all of us here. Liang, and this really kind of has connection with both what was happening in Athens in the 77, but also in how to interpret the urban heritage of graffiti, and this kind of, well, dilemma of what you gain and what you lose by institutionalization, and especially institutionalization in the frameworks that are already kind of set already. Well, you describe it as a white cube, but there are other kind of milestones that form this, like what is possible. And I'm wondering, have you encountered through your research, not only the example of a movie that you showed, but also like communities, queer community-based initiatives for self-archiving their memory. So community archives or this kind of queering museums across the world, and do they do any kind of work differently than once this art is presented in the big museums, in big art shows?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, that's quite a big question. Actually, yes, because my main interest is how what happens when queer cultures enter the museum and is framed in a certain way, and my current how to say, maybe thesis or thinking is that if we only display them in only the way we imagine what the exhibition should be, then there's always this problem of decontextualize or dishistoricize the initial culture they were born with. And what now interests me is like some collected practices such as group materials during the 80s, who does a lot of collective practices, but they do not necessarily object to work with the institution. They also went to Whitney museums, university museums, but they also do artworks on train station, in undergrounds, on the street, or they do some more like democratic projects, doing questionnaires, asking people how does the issues of AIDS infect their life. So these all kind of collective practices, actually they also resonate a lot of what contemporary artists are doing. As myself, I'm also working with Taiwanese artistic collectives who make a lot of different exhibitions, not just in the museum venue, but also in some streets associated with sex workers, or just doing a banquet. So all of these are very different forms of exhibitions, which are different from what a white cube aesthetics is imagined.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any more questions? Is what I wonder. And if not, then we can really use the lunch break or sneak into the other panel for at least a short time. And then, yeah, because it was a long morning since 10 till almost 1. Thank you so much for really inspiring presentations, but also for a vivid discussion. It would be a pleasure to read your all papers once the book is ready. So hope to have more time to explore these ideas, and good luck with all the work that you're doing, because actually most of you are in the middle of the research project, but also very kind of tangible museum making projects or heritage hub projects. So thank you for your attention, and see you again at, just to check, at 4 o'clock, at 2 o'clock. So
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
bye-bye.
Thank you all, bye.